Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us for this roundtable discussion today about housing and equity. I'm Patty Wayne Cross with Habitat for Humanity East Bay, Silicon Valley, and we're hosting this discussion today because we can't ignore the link between these two issues, between housing and equity. So much opportunity begins at the doorstep of where you live. And unfortunately, we live in a society where deeply entrenched housing segregation means we face a profoundly inequitable landscape. And it's my hope that through this discussion today, we can offer a space to lift up these issues, as well as a concrete foundation from which we can take action to redress them. I'm so excited to be joined this afternoon by three prominent thinkers in the affordable housing space. And I'm going to introduce them to you now, starting with Janice Jensen, who is the president and CEO of Habitat for Humanity East Bay, Silicon Valley, and she has been since January 2005. That's going on 19 years. Janice is a leading advocate for affordable ownership housing policy, and she has served on a range of nonprofit boards working to advance holistic solutions to our housing crisis. In her time with Habitat, Janice has overseen an incredible growth in our programs and services and a true expansion in who and how we serve. I'm also excited to be joined today by Richard Rothstein, whom many of you may know as the author of the 2017 book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. It's a work that really rejects the myth of de facto housing segregation and analyzes our government's role in that segregation at every level. Richard Rothstein is also a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute and a senior fellow emeritus of the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He is the author of many articles and books on race and education. And of course, he is the co-author of the new book, Just Action, How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law. Welcome, Richard, and also excited to be joined by Richard's co-author and his daughter, Leah Rothstein, who has worked on public policy and community change from the grassroots level all the way to the halls of government. Leah is a strong, longtime advocate for positive change in our communities. She has years under her belt as a community organizer in a variety of spaces, including housing, as well as public safety, labor, environmental justice, and youth leadership, to name a few. She's worked as a consultant on community development and affordable housing policy with nonprofit housing developers, cities and counties, redevelopment agencies, private firms. So really quite a breadth and depth of experience in this space. So very excited to welcome all three of you to this conversation, which is going to be a meaty one. So before we dive into the meat of the discussion, just a quick question to the panel to warm the three of us up for the conversation. And that is, what is your favorite place in the Bay Area? Why don't we begin with Leah?
Oh, it's such a tough one. I live in Oakland. I love my neighborhood, but I guess to choose one, I think the East Bay Regional Parks. So I live about 5 to 10 minutes down the hill from Redwood Park and Roberts Regional Park, and I can just go up the hill and be in the forest in a couple of minutes, and it's amazing. I am so grateful for being that close to nature.
Absolutely. What about you, Richard?
Well, I have to say that my favorite places are the three places where my children and grandchildren live, all of them in the East Bay.
And Janice, how about you?
Well, I am a beach bum at heart. So for me, anywhere in the coast, I don't care what beach in the Bay Area we're talking about. If there's sand and seawater and I have barefoot toes, I'm a happy girl.
Well, I think those are three great reasons the Bay Area can be a fantastic, vibrant place to live, and why I think we're also invested in the work to be sure it's also an equitable place to live. So with that, Janice, I'm going to come back to you just to begin the conversation. I know you're really excited to talk with Richard and Leah Rothstein today, in particular because I know that the book, The Color of Law, made a huge impact on you. Can you share a little bit about your experience of reading that work and why you were so excited to continue that conversation and that train of thought with Just Action?
Well, I think The Color of Law is a brilliant book, and it really lays out the systemic racism in this country that I think all of us have little nuggets of knowledge about, but I had never understood how it all fit together. And I think in my own ignorance, I thought, oh, this was going to be focused in the deep South. Well, the book starts out literally in my own backyard in Richmond, Oakland, Silicon Valley. And so that got my attention. All the areas that our Habitat affiliate serves. And it was so spot on. It was just very succinctly laid out, fact-based. So this is not somebody's opinion of what happened, but it's a little shocking in this day and age to see some of those vestiges from yesteryear that still are around today. Some we know, some we didn't. Anyway, I have really advocated this book for my staff, my board, volunteers, anybody. I think it's a must read for anybody who has a serious interest in understanding the history of systemic inequities in housing in this country. It's not just the Bay Area. It manifests itself real big here, but it's everywhere. It's a brilliant book. And thank you again, Richard, for writing it.
And so on that note, for Richard and Leah, I'm sure that's not an uncommon response to that work. And so what motivated you to follow up on The Color of Law with Just Action? What are you hoping people take away from reading this book?
Well, it was that response that motivated me to get started thinking about this book. As Patty, both you and Janice said, The Color of Law demolished the myth of de facto segregation, demonstrated that the reason we're segregated in every metropolitan area of this country is because of racially explicit policy on the part of federal, state, and local governments. Of course, there was private bigotry and discrimination throughout the society, but had the government enforced the Constitution, fulfilled its obligations under the Constitution, that private bigotry would not have been permitted to express itself. And there were plenty of opportunities for the government to enforce it that it refused. Because we have an unconstitutional system of segregation, I concluded that all of us as Americans have an obligation to do something to fix it. It's not simply an opportunity, not something we just wish we could do. We have an obligation as Americans to enforce the Constitution. Just as we accept the privileges of American citizenship, we have an obligation to accept the responsibilities as well. So people read that book. I gave many talks to groups like this one about it, and everywhere I went, and everybody who wrote to me about the book said, well, what can we do about it now? And even though I thought I had a right to retire, I felt I had an obligation to answer that question. And so I asked my daughter, Leah, who knows an awful lot about housing policy, more than I do. I knew the history, but she knew a lot about housing policy. I asked her to help me answer this question. And that's what motivated me to write the book, the new book with Leah, Just Action.
Yeah, I could pick up from there. So I was one of the people who asked my dad, what do we do about this now? You know, it's great. It's important and vital that we reckon with the true history of how we came to be segregated. But, you know, I've worked in housing policy. I've been a community organizer, and I didn't feel like I knew what to do to truly and effectively challenge racial segregation. It feels overwhelming, intractable. It feels sometimes like just the way our country is, and there's little that can be done to change it. So when I asked my dad, well, what do we do now? And he sort of challenged me to help him answer it. It took me a little while, but I eventually agreed. And I wanted to find the hope in answering that question, that there is a lot that can be done. And I actually did come out of this project of writing this book with a lot of hope and a lot of ideas and inspiration of what can be done and what is being done around the country to challenge this history and the legacy of segregation. That it's intractable and it's overwhelming, but it's not impossible to do anything about it. So I'm excited that I was part of this project to be able to pass along that message.
And I can definitely agree. I felt a surprising amount of optimism after reading this book several times, because it does feel like a huge problem, but this does really give you the sense that something is possible. And one of the huge underlying factors in housing segregation that you wrote a lot about, Richard, in The Color of Law, and you write a lot about in Just Action, the both of you, is homeownership. So I want to start there. That's a core focus of the work we do at Habitat for Humanity. And of course, like I said, a huge underlying factor in housing segregation and in the racial wealth gap that we see in this country. So Janice, starting with you, this is for the full panel, but I'll start with you, Janice. Why homeownership in particular? Why focus on that?
Well, that is Habitat for Humanity's core mission. And and it aligns with our mission. It is everything we're about. And I think homeownership, it's such a great opportunity, and it's sort of the backbone in this country. If you look back on how people had wealth generation over the years and the decades, but it is also, there's an enormous amount of data that shows the connection directly between being home ownership and a mortgage that is affordable to you and your family, and better educational outcomes for children, better health, both physical and mental, and by better financial health, and of course, generational wealth building. And systemically, we have left a whole lot of people out of that opportunity. So I think the challenge to us is that when we look at housing discrimination and unfair access to home ownership in particular, it's just a profound problem, and the legacy of that has left a lot of people behind. And I think the data suggests that Black home ownership rates have not changed in 50 years. That's unacceptable. And you look in the Bay Area, and it's even worse here. So I think that most of the people we partner with are the families that we serve are BIPOC families, and that's great. And now we are actually stepping up our own game here to be far more intentional. We're part of Habitat for Humanity's Advancing Black Home Ownership program. And so we are looking at it much deeper. And we're specifically targeting the areas of systemic bias in home buying, financing, exclusionary zoning, which restricts access. You don't have to look very far in the housing crisis anywhere in this country to see the legacy of discrimination, and very true here in our own backyard. So I think at Habitat, we don't have the luxury of separating out housing justice from racial justice. To make a real difference here, we have to address inequality. And that's what we're trying to do by being far more intentional than we have historically. It's a big job, but then again, I think the optimism in this book breaks it down into doable bites. And that's what we're trying to do. Got a long way to go.
And Richard and Leah, you talk a lot in Just Action about ways, in addition to simply building more, and making sure more of that building is affordable, ways that we can address that homeownership gap. Do you want to talk about some of those other ways that you outline?
Sure. Well, I'll go back a bit to the history that is covered in The Color of Law, and we touch on a bit in Just Action, just to underlie what Janice was talking about needing strategies to address increasing homeownership opportunities, but also specific strategies to increase homeownership opportunities for African Americans, because there were specific policies and programs that kept African Americans out of homeownership when it was affordable. So after World War II, when the federal government helped to subsidize getting middle class and working class families into homeownership by subsidizing building suburbs and subdivisions around the country, it did so on the basis of excluding African Americans from being able to purchase these homes. The homes at the time were affordable. So the white families who were able to get into home ownership then over the generations have built wealth that they could then pass down from generation to generation to help current home buyers buy homes using that intergenerational wealth transfer for their down payments. African American families were explicitly prohibited from getting into home ownership when it was affordable, so explicitly prohibited from building wealth the same way. So we can build all the homes we want today and have equal access across races to those homes, but whites will be more likely to be able to afford them and have the wealth to put down for a down payment, while African American households will be less likely to be able to do that. So in order to address those kinds of disparities, we need specific policies and programs to address those specific harms. One of them is down payment assistance that is targeted to African American families, grants, forgivable loans, favorable mortgages, assistance with their credit scores, and accessing credit through financial institutions with favorable interest rates to keep the price of home ownership for African American families attainable. So those are a few ideas.
Let me add, if I may, a point to this. One of the things we emphasize in Just Action is that although the federal government played a very large role in creating segregation. Once we have segregation, much of the policy and programs that sustain it are local. And there's an enormous opportunity at the local level for engaged citizens to do something to redress segregation. There's so many different options of activities they can take. It doesn't really matter where you start. Home ownership is one of them. I'll give you one example of a purely local issue that is subject to action and effective action by local activists. We have good reason to believe, based on surveys that have been done and testing, that the real estate industry continues to discriminate against African Americans who can already own homes and are looking for them. And the only way to wipe out that discrimination, to remedy it, is with a testing program that most local fair housing centers don't have the resources to conduct. And one of the things that's a purely local activity that would increase the rate of African American home ownership is support for fair housing centers at a local level that can engage in testing of real estate agents, realtors, to ensure that that kind of discrimination is ended. As I said, almost 50% of interactions between African Americans and realtors are discriminatory. African American homeowners being shown different homes from whites, being told different stories about neighborhoods where they're looking. That's only a local issue. It can't be fixed at a national level. And it's quite aside from increasing the number of homes, which is part of your mission, we can also increase the access of African Americans to homes that already exist by eliminating discrimination in the real estate industry.
I think that's a great point. And speaking of, both increasing the number of available homes, but also increasing that access, you talk a lot about development and just action. And so I want to actually go back to you, Richard. This question is for the full panel, but I'll begin with you. Like I said, we clearly need more housing. We need more of it to be affordable. We need more access. But to really address segregation and to remedy that, what kind of housing do we need to be building?
Well, one of the myths that we have in this country about race is that all African Americans are poor. That is not the case. Most African Americans are not poor. They are lower income than whites on average, but they could afford homes if homes are affordable. Here in the Bay Area, they're not affordable. And for middle class African Americans who have jobs, have good incomes, but still can't afford housing, we have subsidy programs, and much of the assistance that we talk about is aimed at lower income families. And there's a missing middle that is not being served. People who earn too much to benefit from, for example, Section 8 or LIHTC support. And I'm talking about Section 8 home ownership even. But so they earn too much to benefit from those programs and too little to afford market rate housing. So one of the things we have to begin to focus on is creating missing middle housing, neighborhoods that are diverse, not only in race, but in income, not just mixing the lowest income and the highest income families, but middle income families as well. There are very little federal subsidies for that. This is, again, purely a local issue. There are parts of the country that have developed programs to support with much milder subsidies than, for example, Section 8, to support middle income housing that will fill in the gap between the lowest income and the highest income families. And so beginning to think carefully about not only creating projects, and I mean by that developments, duplexes, triplexes, if we challenge zoning as we're doing here in California, that mix the lowest income and the highest income families, but also the vast African American middle class that tends to be much more disadvantaged than white middle class families with the same incomes. Middle class African Americans live in neighborhoods with higher poverty rates. They live than whites do with the same incomes. They live in neighborhoods with more deteriorated buildings than whites do with the same incomes. And they need housing support as well. So one of the things I would urge you to think about is how we avoid this terrible exaggeration that we're dealing with African American home ownership issues only if we deal with the lowest income families.
Boy, I sure appreciate that, and I totally agree. We've saw that exact thing play out long time ago, and we started serving moderate income families. We historically had only served very low and low income, and we said, wait a minute, they didn't call it missing middle back then, but that's exactly what was going on. And so we intentionally started having a very mixed income developments, and frankly, all of our developments since then have been mixed income, and they're a lot more robust. And I'm a big fan of that, but it is, especially in the Bay Area, it's shocking. If you happen to be a moderate income family, you make too much, as you say, to get any subsidy, and not enough for the market rate lenders to be interested in you. So you're kind of between a rock and a hard place. And that is one area that is a sweet spot for Habitat, and we have definitely focused in on that. And one of our advancing Black home ownership initiatives is to reach out to those moderate income African American families to see where you live in, how you live in, and is there a spot here? Being more intentional, doing what we're doing, but with much more intention.
And Leah, I'm curious, it's hard to talk about development, especially here in the Bay Area, when you have to balance that goal of affordability, but the expense of building and the expense of land. Obviously, that's a difficult balance to navigate. So how do you promote affordability and combat housing segregation without disincentivizing development, especially in a place like the Bay Area?
Well, I think just like Janice said, it's about being intentional and smart and thoughtful about it. So there's a lot of ways a local government can incentivize building affordable housing within market rate developments. They can require it. So there's, the carrot, stick, and removing barriers. So jurisdictions can pass an inclusionary housing ordinance that requires that when new market rate housing is built, a certain percentage of the units have to be affordable. Now, they can craft that ordinance however they want. It should be done along with an economic analysis that shows, at what point does that requirement make the development financially infeasible, and keep the requirement below that point, because developers want to build and they will do it and they will adhere to those requirements as long as their project pencils. And so if you do a smart economic analysis and you can show that X percentage, maybe 10, 15, 20% of units as affordable in this project still makes it financially feasible, that project will be built. Now, a jurisdiction can decide that they want to prioritize middle income housing and require in their inclusionary zoning ordinances larger percentages of inclusionary units at higher income levels, so at middle income affordability levels, and fewer affordable units at lower income levels. So there's a lot of ways to play with that kind of policy to meet different policy objectives. I just talked yesterday with a developer in Philadelphia, a private for-profit developer who builds mixed income and inclusionary and affordable projects purely because they pencil and they work and they increase the sort of vitality of the community that he lives in, and it makes him money. And so he doesn't do it because it's required by the local government. He does it voluntarily, but because that there are incentives built into the building code in that city, or there were, he could make it work. So a local government could pass tax abatement programs where if a developer builds a certain percentage of affordable units, they get some tax abatement for a certain number of years. So there's a lot that can be done, and you'll hear, if you haven't picked up on this already, in the theme of us talking about, what we write about in Just Action, is there's a lot of sort of smaller incremental pieces that go a long way towards making change. And there's no one sort of answer that will address all of this, but there's a lot that can be done locally to begin to incentivize, to require, to promote building affordable housing and mixed income housing. Another example is, every jurisdiction, every state has a certain allocation of low-income housing tax credits, which is the largest funding source for low-income subsidized housing. And the state decides how to allocate those tax credits. And in that allocation process, they have to receive public comment on their allocation plan. Local residents can organize and contribute to that public comment to advocate that the state requires that some of those low-income housing tax credits are used to build mixed income housing, for example, or used to build affordable housing in higher opportunity, higher cost, more affluent communities, so that we're not continuing to build low-income housing in areas of high poverty. We want to sort of desegregate all communities. And part of that is ensuring that we don't only build low-income housing in low-income communities. So one way we can do that is through the tax credit allocation process. Another place we can contribute and advocate and have our voices be heard on the local level to make that kind of change.
I'm glad you brought that up, Leah, because I was struck by early on in Just Action, you and Richard write that we can't afford to be choosy when it comes to deciding between taking place-based approaches. So what you refer to improving, investing in resources in existing lower income, lower resource neighborhoods, and what you call mobility approaches, or opening up access and increasing diversity in higher resource neighborhoods. So, we're talking about what we should be building, how to get more of it built, but also in a sense, we're talking about where we should be building. And so Leah, I'll come back to you actually with this. How do we navigate that balance between these two types of approaches?
Yeah, I don't think there's one prescriptive way for every community to navigate that balance. It depends on the community, the opportunities, the challenges, the needs of that community. So I'll just give a little more explanation of what these two sort of categories that we talk about are. One is what are called place-based strategies, which are concerned with increasing resources and investments in lower income segregated communities, where the concentration of poverty is a direct result of government-sponsored segregation. So to challenge and redress and remedy the consequences of that segregation, we want to make these areas of higher opportunity, of greater resource, better access to jobs and safe homes and more affordable housing and open space and transportation. Now, we also understand that when that happens in a lower income community, when investments increase, often gentrification occurs and prices rise and people with higher incomes want to move in and the longtime residents of those communities are displaced. So we need to couple those increased investment strategies with anti-displacement strategies. So strategies that protect renters from rapidly increasing rents or unjust evictions. The inclusionary zoning policy I talked about is a great strategy for preventing some displacement in gentrifying communities. So that's one category with a lot of options of strategies and policies you could take on if that was your primary concern or your first issue to tackle. And then the other category of strategies we talk about are mobility strategies. So those concerned with opening up exclusive, expensive, usually predominantly white or suburban communities to diverse residents. To do that through zoning changes, like I said, placing more affordable housing in those communities, subsidies for African Americans to buy into those communities, rental or home ownership subsidies. So there, again, a lot of strategies in that category that we can take on. And what we say is, you're right, we can't afford to be choosy. We're going to need all of these strategies eventually. We need to both open up exclusive white communities and increase investments in segregated lower income communities. It sort of doesn't matter which we start with. It just matters that we get started somewhere. So every community's starting place will be different. But what we advocate for in Just Action is that communities, residents of those communities need to start by getting to know each other and learning about the history of their own community, how it came to be segregated, and then start to learn about what opportunities are for challenging that segregation. And that will be different in every community how they start, but they just need to get started.
Agreed. And Janice, I know that you often call it a both and proposition. So I would venture to guess that you would agree with what Leah's saying.
100%. This is a both and proposition for Habitat. And it means that we are investing in lower income communities with housing and to bring them up, bring more amenities in. And we're also investing in higher income communities, like example, what we're now building in Walnut Creek, a very affluent community, and 42 home ownership opportunities in a beautiful neighborhood that is right next to transit. That's the other thing we try to do, not just mixed income, but higher density, close to transit, and we build very sustainable, no matter where we're building, environmentally sustainable. In Walnut Creek, it's a zero net energy development. That means it will produce more energy than it actually consumes. I think all of this is core to where we're going with our strategies. We have to be opportunistic with land because it's so scarce here, and it's hard to come by. Normally we are able to get infill lots. That's kind of our sweet spot for building. But we also want to know, when we look at that infill lot, what would be our impact on the surrounding neighborhood. We want the neighborhood involved. And so that outreach starts early, as you're talking about, Leah, getting people to understand, to know who we are, what we're doing, who might be their new neighbors. And with a lot of talking, a lot of community meetings, the vast majority of people come around to that. And so I think that selling an affordable home with an appropriate mortgage size to the family's income not only is good for the family, but it provides more stability to the surrounding neighborhoods and the communities. And we do that in a variety of communities. But you also mentioned something in the book and just now, Leah, about displacement. We have a very big and growing program of home preservation, where we work with low-income homeowners who were able to buy their home decades ago, usually, now have a lot of deferred maintenance. They may be on a fixed income, and it's very easy for them to be displaced. So we work with them to go in and provide critical home repairs and, ramps, roofs, a lot of new roofs, mold mitigation, all kinds of things to make that home safe and habitable so that they can stay there. And then the other thing we do is we're a HUD certified housing counseling agency. One of the things we learned many, many years ago is the vast majority of people who come and wanting to get involved with the Habitat program are not ready to be homeowners. So what we do is we offer them an opportunity to get their financial house in order, if you will. And we work with them one-on-one, or in groups, however they want to do it, to get their FICO scores going, to make sure that they are ready to be a homeowner, that they don't have a lot of consumer debt, that they can handle a mortgage and home maintenance, all of that. So by the time they're done with that program, it gives them so many more opportunities for housing solutions, whether it's through Habitat or another program, and maybe not even to own it all, but to be a much smarter renter. And I think all of that helps have an impact on the community, but it is definitely a yes and. We can't just pick one strategy and say that's it for us. We have to be far more opportunistic and inclusive than that.
And Richard, Leah mentioned earlier, and it's definitely mentioned in Just Action, that with these place-based strategies, some degree of gentrification is likely, if not inevitable. But I was interested in the fact that you have a section in Chapter 6 on conscientious gentrification. Can you say a little bit more about what that phrase means?
Yes, some displacement is inevitable. There's no way. It's really a matter of simple economic logic. There is a fantasy among some people that you can improve the quality of a low-income neighborhood, improve the resources, improve the schools, improve the retail access, and still no non-low-income people will want to move in. That's a fantasy. So there are going to be people who are going to move into neighborhoods that previously they wouldn't have considered, but as they improve, there are going to be some African-American homeowners in those neighborhoods who are going to take advantage of the rising value of their homes and sell to make a profit the same way that whites do, and they shouldn't be prevented from doing that. So there is going to be some diversity that ordinarily naturally follows improvement in the quality of a neighborhood. But those people who move into the neighborhood have an obligation to understand that they're moving into a neighborhood that they have to adapt to, not that the neighborhood has to adapt to them. Of course, to some extent it has to. The retail outlets that are there are going to be somewhat different, but we describe, based on a leaflet that a gentrifier produced for his neighbors, about the ways in which people who do gentrify a neighborhood can behave in a responsible way so that they blend into the neighborhood rather than demanding the neighborhood blended to them. One of the most important ways is to send their children to the local public schools, which are often mischaracterized as being bad schools. They're not bad schools. I used to be, as you may know, an education writer. I visited many, many low-income schools in Black neighborhoods. The teachers are wonderful. They're dedicated. They're working harder than teachers work in middle-class schools where they're just passing kids through who are already have educations at home and need very little that the schools offer. They're in many cases very good schools, and they will become better if conscientious gentrifiers send their children to them. That's one thing. They can patronize local businesses rather than creating a excessive demand for new businesses that cater more to their tastes. They can learn to shop at local markets. They can learn to attend local churches. They'll learn an enormous amount from adapting themselves to those neighborhoods rather than demanding that all change go in the other direction.
So you and Leah both have talked a lot about these very specific, very localized actions, which I thought was really interesting because in The Color of Law, there's a lot of focus on federal policy, but so much of the suggested action in Just Action is highly localized. And I was really interested in the fact that near the conclusion of the book, you and Leah cite a few case studies of communities where there have been successful campaigns for long-term housing integration. I realize that you do mention affordability these days is presenting new challenges to that housing integration, but I am curious, what would you say are some common elements of those examples that you offer that made them successful? That's for all of you, but Richard, if you want to start that off, please go ahead.
Well, sure. The common element of all of them is an organized group of residents who are determined to maintain their neighborhood as a high-quality neighborhood that's more diverse. And the examples that we give are historic examples, but it can still be the case today. You know, frequently when a neighborhood begins, and this is particularly true of inner ring neighborhoods, inner ring suburbs, when the neighborhood begins to diversify because of the myths of diversity, whites flee. We call it white flight. And that can be prevented with education of the community. It requires a very active, organized group. You know, we call it a reinvigorated civil rights movement, but an organized group in those communities that is determined to maintain its diversity. We describe, for example, and these are historic examples that we give in the book, we describe a community, Oak Park, Illinois. Its lessons are still applicable today, even though its policy is probably not necessary anymore. But Oak Park, Illinois, when it began to diversify and African Americans began to move in, homeowners had the usual phony fear that their property values would decline if the neighborhood became more diverse. So what Oak Park did is it enacted a property value insurance program in which homeowners could, for a very tiny token fee, buy an insurance policy against the possible decline in the value of their homes. The program lasted for about 20 years. It never paid out a single benefit. Because no property values declined as the neighborhood became more diverse. But the community was very conscientious and intentional about maintaining a balance of people in that community. They had an organization that worked with, and this doesn't apply just to landlords. This community had both rental and home ownership opportunities. It worked with landlords and compensated them for keeping their units open until they found renters who would maintain a stable diversity of the project. And this can be done, with home ownership as well as with apartment rentals. Diversity has to be intentional. There's too much fear, too many. As I said at the very beginning, realtors who are willing to exploit that fear. One of the things that these communities did is they certified realtors who would not steer families away from diverse neighborhoods. There are so many, as Leah said, there are so many different ways in which this can be approached, but I've just mentioned a couple of them.
And Leah, Richard just also mentioned the fact that these took place through organized groups, right? Conscientious action by organized groups. And something that I feel like you're careful to emphasize in Just Action is how important it is for these groups to be biracial, multi-ethnic committees that carry out this work. So why is that vital, for one question? And my second question is, how do you create committees like that when, because of housing segregation, we don't get a lot of that organic encountering of people outside our race in our daily lives outside of work?
Yeah, great question. So it is vital that we get to know each other across races, that we talk a lot about the policy changes we need to challenge segregation, but just as important as the policy changes is our changes in attitudes about who we want to live next to, what we want our community to look like, what a vibrant, healthy community is. And that, applies to the Oak Park example from 50 years ago, and it applies to the Bay Area today, where NIMBYs, not in my backyard, folks will oppose any affordable housing because they think the character of their neighborhood will suffer. So we need to challenge those ideas. And one way to do that is to get to know people of other races and stop fearing sort of diversity and change as something negative and start to see it as a positive character of a community. So we do advocate that to start these groups that can organize for change, we need to start to build those relationships, because these groups, they do need to be biracial, multi-ethnic. Leadership needs to come from those impacted by segregation, so African-American families and activists, and those, from white communities where there's more political power and more resources. That leadership needs to be shared. And just like you said, because we live in segregated communities, we don't necessarily develop those relationships naturally. Dropping your kids off at school or going to the grocery store. If you live in a segregated community, you see people who look like you. So we have to take some intentional steps to build those relationships. Now, in Just Action, all of these examples we give of strategies and suggestions and recommendations, we tell a story of a community that's done it. So we give some examples of communities around the country that have taken these extra steps to build cross-race relationships and have been successful. Some of these groups then went on to advocate for change, to build Habitat for Humanity homes, to advocate for changing the high school curriculum to include African-American history. And so these groups, they start by, one example I'll give is from Chicago, which this example comes from an artist named Tanika Johnson. She's a photographer, and she's an artist with an activist bent, and she wanted to show a visual representation of what segregation looks like in Chicago. Now, Chicago is built on a perfect grid, so when you fold the map of Chicago in half, the houses on the north side, which is the white side of town, sit exactly on top when you fold the map in half of the houses on the south side of town, the African-American side, with the same house numbers on the north and south side of the same street. So she took photographs of those homes, called them map twins, to show how those homes, are fairly similar in structure, but the surrounding areas, the context they exist in, are very different because of segregation of those neighborhoods. And then she introduced herself to the residents of the homes and asked if they wanted to meet their map twin. And many of them did. They met their map twin, they toured each other's neighborhoods, they developed relationships and learned that they actually had a lot in common, and they learned how their communities are different. Now, many of these people had lived in Chicago their whole lives and had never been to the other race side of town or known somebody from the other side of town. So they built these groups. They started with map twins, and they built block twin groups where they do neighborhood beautification efforts. So this is an example. Now, Tanika's a photographer, not an organizer, but these groups are now formed. An organizer could come in and help them figure out what they could do to challenge the consequences of segregation that they're learning about. This is a sort of like it's a unique example because of the layout of Chicago, but it can be replicated elsewhere. There's a lot of communities that are taking other steps to bring people from other race parts of town to start to get to know each other and break down those barriers. And that's an essential first step.
Yeah, that map example is one of my favorites. Sorry, Richard, go ahead.
I was just going to add to what Leah just said. It is, as she emphasized, it does not require a grid system. Even in Chicago, an organization called the Chicago Bungalow Association decided to adopt Tanika Johnson's scheme by introducing families who lived in similar neighborhoods in different race parts of the city, who had nothing to do with a folded map. They just were randomly living in segregated neighborhoods. She introduced them to each other. I think of, and I don't know the Bay Area nearly as well as Leah does, but I think of a place like Antioch, which is a perfect place for such introductions to be made to create a biracial committee that can do an enormous amount to make sure that Antioch does not flip from being a healthy community to one that becomes more and more segregated. And you don't need a folded map to do that. What you need is people who have the intention. You can do it with churches. One of the things that we describe in Just Action is a group of churches in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. There were 6 Presbyterian churches there. 3 were white, 3 were black. They knew very little about each other. And they decided to create something they called the Presbyterian Interracial Dialogue, a group of 40. They restricted it to 20 whites, 20 African Americans. If somebody dropped out, they had to be replaced by somebody of the same race. And they began to talk with each other and learn from each other and read books together. And eventually they actually made some real serious policy changes in the city of Winston-Salem through these relationships that they developed.
I remember that example, Richard, and I remember specifically that one of the Black pastors, when he was approached about getting involved, his initial hesitation was that he was afraid that it would stop at conversation, that dialogue would be the point and it wouldn't move beyond that and become action. And so the book, of course, is called Just Action. I want to end on that note, which is action, of course. And so beginning with Richard and Leah, what are some concrete, substantive, specific actions that people can walk away from this conversation with today to redress housing segregation so that this doesn't stop at conversation? What do you recommend? What can we do today?
Well, we can start by building these cross-race relationships, find an organization that's doing this, start this ourselves. There's a lot of sort of self-started groups like this. And I'll give an example in a second, but we start by getting together and talking to each other and learning about our own community, what's happening in terms of housing and segregation, how we got here. So a lot of times communities that have started working on these issues started because homeowners there discovered racially restrictive covenants on the deeds of their own homes. These are the covenants written into the deeds in the mid-20th century that said the home could only be owned or occupied by whites. A lot of people don't believe that their own community, their own home was intentionally segregated until they see this written into the paperwork of their own home. And it started people to investigate how common that was in their community. They've created maps and inventories of where the covenants are. They've gotten high school students involved in crowdsource volunteering efforts to inventory these covenants and create educational campaigns to educate their community about how they came to be segregated. It's an important step because once we see that intentional action created segregation, we can start to see that intentional action can begin to undo it. So I have a little story from nearby in San Mateo, San Mateo County in Menlo Park. A group started by doing this. They developed an educational training program called Color of Law Menlo Park Edition, where they went through the history of how Menlo Park came to be so segregated, came to be in the affordable housing crisis that it's in. And they did this training virtually during the pandemic to all sorts of groups. They started to build an organization through that training of people who were committed to making their community a more diverse, more inclusive place. So they had a set of values and missions and goals. And in order to be a part of the organization, you had to agree with those values around inclusivity and diversity and, more access to housing, affordability options in their community. And so they were building this organization. And during that time, a local school district from the neighboring city, actually the neighboring school district, which serves a lower income population, they had a vacant parcel of land, and they proposed to build 90 units of housing affordable for teachers on that land because teachers couldn't afford to live anywhere nearby. And 30% of teachers in this district left the district every year because they couldn't find housing that they could afford. And so they proposed this 90 units on a vacant lot. And some neighbors opposed it, and they ended up putting a measure on the ballot that would have made this development impossible, and any future housing that required a zoning change would have to go before the voters. So it would make virtually any future affordable housing or multifamily housing impossible to build in this community, very hard. And this group that had formed based on the training about the history of segregation in their community, they saw this because they had been, talking about these issues. They saw this as another step in the sort of progression of segregation and maintaining that segregation. So they recognized it for what it was, and they launched a campaign to defeat the measure. They had volunteers go out every weekend, knocking on every door in the community. And they found a lot of support in their community where they didn't necessarily expect to. I talked to some leaders of the campaign. They told me about going out on a Saturday, standing in front of a big house and thinking, I have to go knock on this door, but these people aren't going to support us. And then they would start talking to them and realize that they did support them, that they had the same vision for their community. They wanted teachers to be able to live there. And they defeated the measure. So they had, huge success in defeating this measure. The teacher housing will be built. Future affordable housing is still possible in this community. So it's a great example of not only sort of challenging the opposition we will inevitably face when we take on these issues, but also how that slow work of organizing, building community, building a shared vision and values around inclusivity and diversity really then translates into change and into policy and programmatic change that we need to challenge segregation. So that's an example of how we can get started.
And Richard, what about you? In addition to conscientiously reaching out and forming these groups and learning our history, what would you recommend for actions people can undertake?
Well, here's something very simple to start with, even before you organize a local group. I mentioned before that there are fair housing centers all over the country, here in the Bay Area. And Leah, maybe you can remind me of the name of the one that I encountered a couple of weeks ago.
Project Sentinel.
Project Sentinel, yes. I gave a talk in Modesto, and there at a table in the back of the talk was a lawyer from a group called Project Sentinel that covers the Bay Area, the East Bay and Silicon Valley, as well as going into the Central Valley, that engages in paired testing, that is sending African-American and white testers to realtors and landlords to see if they're treated differently, and then prosecutes, files complaints, legal complaints against those who are not. This is something that individuals can do. What she was there doing, what this lawyer was there doing with her table, is recruiting volunteers to be these testers. And you don't need to be part of an organized group yet to do this. And this is something anybody who wants to take a first step to meeting people of diverse backgrounds, as well as playing an important role in helping to eliminate discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. This is something I can do, is contact Project Sentinel and volunteer to be one of these testers.
That's great. And Janice, I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to bring this back home, so to speak, to our work at Habitat for Humanity. So when we talk about taking action, what does that look like when it comes to Habitat? What should our community be doing?
Well, before I get into specifics on that, I just want to, what Leah and Richard just said, is advocacy. And advocacy is one of the foundational things that we as a community can do to make change, whether it's public policies for affordable housing, how it's funded, either how it's obstructed or not. It is so important. And I know for us at Habitat, that's something we have learned over many years, and we're very active in. So bringing it back to the Habitat community, I would say get involved. It truly takes a community to build a community. And I'm not talking just about the physical community, it's the human community of connection. So help us build, advocate. We do a lot of that, as I said. It's a very big tent at Habitat. There's not a piece of our organization that does not have volunteer involvement in it. And that's literally from our board of directors on down. And so there's a place for everybody, whatever is your area of interest, there's a place for you. I also want to reflect on what Richard and Leah talk about in Just Action that really connected with me was the importance of that interpersonal, intentional connection. Interpersonal, intentional connection. And that, I think that's the kind of connection that we miss out on when we stay in our bubbles. And we might look out and say, oh, but I couldn't ever do anything like that. We can, and we do. And within Habitat, break your bubble, get involved. So many of those successful actions that are cited in this book are really so antithetical to Habitat. It's who we are, it's what we do. That connectivity is truly the heartbeat of the Habitat and our work to serve the community. It's that on the ground community building. It is Habitat's DNA. So I would say get involved, find your niche, and then join us. And what I will promise you, my personal promise, is that you will work hard. You will get to know amazing people that you may not have gotten to know if you didn't get out of your bubble. And you're going to be a change maker. And on top of all that, you're going to have fun. We take fun very seriously at Habitat. So I really encourage everybody. First of all, I encourage you to read this book. It is a wonderful way to break down the big concepts and to start taking action. It's all about action, and it's localized. We can do this, but we have to be together. So get involved.
Well, on that note, I want to thank the three of you so much for being a part of this conversation today. Janice Jensen, Leah and Richard Rothstein. Thank you three so much for your incredible work in this space, for everything the three of you do every day to advance equitable housing in our communities. Thank you so much for that, sincerely, and for the book as well. I also want to thank everyone that has attended and tuned in for this event today. Each of you who has taken time to be a part of this conversation, just by being here, you recognize that we are all capable of doing something concrete that addresses housing inequity. Richard and Leah write in Just Action that once we understand that segregation didn't happen naturally or by accident, it is a small step to realize that equally purposeful action can fix it. And so with people coming together like this to learn, to question, to converse on these issues, I feel so much optimism that this understanding will inspire that equally purposeful action. You are the people that can change things. So thank you so much for being here with us, for being a part of this movement. Clearly, there is so much more conversation to be had than we've had time for today. And I think it's so vital that we keep this conversation alive. We keep this conversation actionable. I hope that we can see this roundtable today as a beginning and as an invitation to engage further and more deeply in these important issues. So I wanted to offer a few key ways here at this link that you'll see on your screen in just a moment, for ways that you can get more involved. Whether you want to engage through Habitat in some of the ways that Janice mentioned earlier, whether you want to read some of the excellent content that Richard and Leah are posting regularly over at their Just Action Substack, or you can check out the Redress Movement, which is a multiracial movement to take direct action to redress housing segregation. You can find links to all that and more by scanning the QR code here or visiting that URL on your screen. However you do it, like Janice said, like Richard and Leah have referred to, the important thing is that you get engaged, you stay engaged, and you find those ways that you can act for housing justice. Thank you again so much for being with us today.